Hi, my name is Ken Fox. I'm head of library and archives at the George Eastman Museum. I'll be providing an introduction to the 1929 film, The Scar of Shame. In his 2019 book, Stony the Road, Reconstruction, White Supremacy, and the Rise of Jim Crow, Henry Louis Gates Jr. confronts the notorious 1915 film, The Birth of a Nation. Gates argues that with this epic 3-hour blockbuster, director D.W. Griffith essentially rewrote the history of the Civil War and Reconstruction and relied heavily on the white supremacist mythology of the Confederate lost cause. According to this revisionist ideology, the Civil War, the bloodiest conflict ever to have taken place on American soil, was a just and noble battle, fought to preserve the Southern way of life. A way of life which, according to this perversion of history, actually benefited the enslaved, but otherwise content Black plantation workers, nearly as much as the white Southern aristocrats who owned them. Before Griffith, the nostalgic fantasies and racist tropes of the lost cause had already been enshrined in the popular plantation literature of the period, sentimental and viciously anti-Black novels, which included Thomas Dixon's 1905 book, The Klansman, upon which The Birth of a Nation was based. This revised history of the war was further reified by hundreds of hastily erected Confederate monuments that began appearing throughout the South as the work of Reconstruction collapsed and the redemption of the Southern states came into full effect. Meanwhile, derogatory visual stereotypes designed to demean and dehumanize Black Americans, what Gates calls Sambo art, were widely circulated and worked to underpin the de jure segregation of Jim Crow. So by the time The Birth of a Nation had its premiere, the racist fictions of the lost cause already occupied a prominent place in the American imagination. But, as Gates argues, never before had racist propaganda been delivered so vividly, so blatantly, and with such insidious power. In the film, Griffith offered a compendium of every major racist stereotype: the Uncle Tom, the coon, the mammy, the tragic mulatto, and most notoriously, the brutal black buck. President Woodrow Wilson, who had arranged for The Birth of a Nation to be screened at the White House, declared famously, and probably apocryphally, "It is like writing history with lightning." The artistic and commercial success of the film was largely responsible for the resurrection of the Ku Klux Klan, murderers and domestic terrorists whom Griffith recast as the protectors of Southern virtue and the heroic embodiment of the lost cause itself. Less well remembered is the fact that The Birth of a Nation also horrified many who saw it, Black and white, and galvanized a strong protest movement. Theaters were picketed, and screenings of the film triggered massive demonstrations around the country, many of which were organized by a reinvigorated NAACP. While some of this passionate response was a reflection of Griffith's undeniable talent as a filmmaker, he was particularly adept at the psychological and emotional manipulations of melodrama. Gates argues that the power and influence of The Birth of a Nation derived from the very nature of movies themselves, and he condemns the, quote, shockingly damaging role that this new form of media, film, played in shaping public opinion about African Americans, end quote. In Stony the Road, Gates goes on to write that the NAACP struggled to, quote, combat the pernicious influence of the emerging industry of film, unprecedented in its reach and its power to inflict harm, by recasting the long history of negative images of the race in a potent new form. While certainly warranted in the case of The Birth of a Nation, Gates's generalized hostility towards motion pictures is unusual, considering all that was happening before and in response to Griffith's film. While Gates is entirely correct about the extraordinary power and unprecedented reach of cinema, its influence wasn't always pernicious, nor its effects necessarily harmful. he fails to recognize that even before the onslaught of The Birth of a Nation, some filmmakers saw in this new popular medium a powerful tool with which to push back against a long history of derogatory misrepresentation. Just as Frederick Douglass and later W.E.B. Du Bois grasped and effectively exploited the truth of the photograph to counter ugly racist imagery, a number of early motion picture producers saw in film an opportunity to portray Black people as something other than childlike, comical, grotesque, or dangerous. Some even saw it as an effective means of promoting racial uplift, strategies for social and economic advancement through education, economic independence, codes of conduct, and the development of a leadership class, which would in turn uplift those on the lower rungs of the ladder. As Alison Nadia Field has written in Uplift Cinema, The Emergence of African American Film and the Possibility of Black Modernity, quote, "The Birth of a Nation may have brought the issue of filmic representation of African Americans to national attention, but leaders of the Uplift Project had already been using motion pictures to disseminate the message of agricultural and industrial training for several years. As early as 1910, moving pictures were integral parts of the Uplift campaigns of the Hampton and Tuskegee Institutes," end quote. Fields goes on to say that these films often served as promotional tools, and as such, subordinated narrative to message in order to showcase the values of a Negro education. Further north, however, in cities such as Chicago, New York, Philadelphia, and Boston, movies were a business venture aimed primarily at entertaining Black audiences. Known in the industry as race films, these independent productions featured Black casts and told stories with themes geared specifically to Black audiences. Melodrama was the genre of choice, and while sometimes crude and often convoluted, they offered Black Americans reflections of their own lives that were, as Fields has written, positive, realistic, and engaged with contemporary debates concerning Black urban life. Some race filmmakers, like the prolific Oscar Michaud, were Black themselves, but often the production companies were interracial enterprises, with the direction and much of the technical work performed by a white crew. And while hardly numerous, it's estimated that between 1910 and 1950, these companies made over 400 race films. Produced, distributed, and exhibited well outside the Hollywood system, for years, race films were often dismissed as amateurish and technically crude, and relatively few survive. But those that do often tell a very different story than critics, many of them white, would have us believe. Though admittedly constrained by limited budgets and sometimes untrained participants, the best of these films present complex treatments of race and racism, caste and class difference, and complex self-representations that go far beyond the blackface of D.W. Griffith's crude stereotypes. The Scar of Shame, released in 1929, but begun 2 years earlier, which perhaps accounts for why the film's date is often given as 1927, is one of the best-known race films and has been hailed by Black film scholar Donald Bogle as perhaps the finest achievement of the entire Black independent film movement. It was the fourth and final film produced by Philadelphia's Colored Players Film Corporation. Despite the company's name, the Colored Players was predominantly white-owned and operated. The exception, and it was a big one, was the involvement of the legendary Sherman H. Dudley, or S.H. Dudley as he preferred. Biographer Felix Clay Fax claims that, like many Southern Blacks who resented being familiarly addressed by whites, Dudley insisted on using only his initials to ward off the insult of being called by his first name. Throughout his long career, S.H. Dudley was an entertainer, stage manager, producer, impresario, theater owner, and entrepreneur at a time when many of these roles in the entertainment industry were off limits to Blacks. Dudley was born during Reconstruction in Dallas, Texas. Though the exact year of his birth is unknown, he was probably only a few years older than D.W. Griffith, who was born in Louisville, Kentucky in 1875. After an early stint as a jockey, Dudley began performing as a comedian on the medicine show circuit, a major outlet for rural entertainment throughout the American South in the decades following the Civil War. In between pitches for miracle nostrums and cure-alls, a Medicine show might feature anything from banjo players, burlesque dancers, and minstrels to Wild West shows, dramatic readings, and later, motion pictures. And it's also where a number of Black performers like Dudley got their start. By the end of the century, Dudley had moved into the more mainstream minstrel circuit and began making a name for himself as a popular performer, even forming his own short-lived minstrel troupe in 1897. But like a lot of Black performers of his generation, Dudley grew tired of minstrelsy's insulting humor and derogatory caricatures of Blacks. In 1904, seeking to expand the depth and variety of Black entertainment, Dudley took over as the frontman and production manager of the Smart Set Company, a Black traveling revue that mixed some minstrelsy with singing, dancing, and comedic performances that presented a more honest, less stereotyped representation of Black life. As Nadine George Graves notes, the troupe's name itself, the Smart Set, evoked Black sophistication, respectability, and propriety, while claiming a high-class status for Black bodies. Sophisticated though the Smart Set's repertoire might have been, there was still room for what became Dudley's most famous act. Included in the 1909 musical comedy His Honor the Barber, in which Dudley appeared to carry on a witty conversation with Patrick, a nodding mule dressed in blue overalls. By 1911, Dudley had left the Smart Set and settled in Washington, D.C., where he focused on establishing a countrywide circuit of Black-owned entertainment venues. By 1916, S.H. Dudley Theatrical Enterprises had grown from 4 theaters in the Virginia, Washington, D.C. area to more than 20 Black-owned or operated theaters across the Midwest and down into the southern states, on what became known as the Dudley Circuit. In 1920, the Dudley Circuit was absorbed into the better-known and even more extensive Theater Owners Booking Association, a lifeline for Black vaudevillians in the decades to come. When it came to movies, according to the Oxford African American Studies Center, Dudley had always been an advocate for race pictures. For a time, he was even under contract with the New York City-based Real Productions. Billed as America's foremost colored artist, Dudley appeared in Reel's 1922 Black cast film Easy Money. But it would be his 1926 meeting with David Starkman, the white owner of a Black Philadelphia theater, that would lead to the formation of the Colored Players Film Corporation and Dudley's most enduring contribution to Black independent filmmaking, The Scar of Shame. As film historian Charles Musser writes, in the early 1920s, Philadelphia was home to a surplus of trained filmmaking talent, cast, crew, and producers who had been left behind by the 1916 collapse of the once mighty Lubin Manufacturing Company. Hollywood was by now the epicenter of the rapidly growing studio system, but, Musser argues, thanks to this pool of personnel, Philadelphia became a center for independent motion pictures, including race films. David Starkman, a self-educated Jewish-Austrian immigrant, was the owner of the city's Standard Film Exchange and the proprietor of a local movie theater that catered to Philadelphia's Black audiences. Though white, Starkman was deeply troubled by the derogatory Black stereotypes he saw in mainstream films, and he wanted to make quality movies with more accurate representations of authentic Black lives. So, in 1926, he sold his theater, secured investments from the city's white professional and merchant classes, and formed the Colored Players Film Corporation in partnership with 2 other Jewish European Americans, Louis Groner and Roy Kalnick, an industry veteran who had already directed at least 3 race films for Superior Art Motion Pictures Incorporated. Over the next 3 years, Colored Players would produce and distribute 4 films, each featuring an all-Black cast, A Prince of His Race and 10 Nights in a Barroom, both from 1926, Children of Fate from 1927, and The Scar of Shame from 1929. Of these 4 films, only 10 Nights in a Barroom and The Scar of Shame have survived. The films were well received by critics and audiences, but by 1927, Colored Players was facing serious financial difficulties, due in large part to the film's increasingly high production values and the challenges distributors of race films often faced securing lucrative bookings in rigidly segregated theaters. There is some dispute as to when and why S.H. Dudley entered the picture, but it is generally agreed that in 1927, the Colored Players Film Corporation underwent a reorganization, and Dudley was installed as president. It's likely Dudley was also able to contribute the funds needed to forestall financial ruin, an interesting reversal of the usual white-black financial paradigm. Interracial collaboration would have been already familiar ground for both men. In 1916, when Dudley's circuit merged with two organizations to form the Southern Consolidated Circuit, Dudley's business partners were white. Starkman, meanwhile, had for years been involved with black films and their audiences. But as Audrey Thomas McCluskey has noted, the overwhelmingly white makeup of the company's production staff, technical crew, and investors complicates the issue of racial categorization and suggests that though the company's objective was to produce more authentic, more uplifting representations of Black life, Colored Players may be more accurately described as, quote, a vehicle for interracial cooperation in the arts during a time when racial animus and rigid segregation were norms in the United States. The preponderance of white men and money may also account for the curious lack of noticeable racial content in 10 Nights in a Barroom, which, based on an 1854 temperance novel, was primarily about alcoholism and domestic violence, and had already been filmed in 1910 with a white cast. And as we shall see, the predominantly white production team may also account for a complex treatment of caste rather than race in The Scar of Shame, which was written by David Starkman himself. It is said that Dudley had long dreamt of a Black Hollywood arising around Washington, D.C., and he may have seen his involvement with the Colored Players as an opportunity to realize that vision. While the company boasted of its liberal use of Philadelphia area on-screen talent in its supporting casts, the headliners were often bona fide celebrities imported from the New York City stage, like Charles S. Gilpin, the original Emperor Jones, or like Shinzi Howard and Lawrence Chennault, borrowed from Oscar Michaud's own lineup of independent screen stars. Unfortunately, Dudley's involvement with the corporation and the corporation itself would be finished by the time The Scar of Shame was seen by most audiences. The talent was there, if not always the money, as was the critical acclaim. The Amsterdam News declared The Scar of Shame in particular had set a new standard of excellence. But the timing couldn't have been worse. The Scar of Shame, a silent film, went into production mere months after Warner Brothers heralded the arrival of sound motion pictures with Don Juan, the first feature-length film to feature a synchronized soundtrack of music and sound effects. And Don Juan was soon followed by the spectacle of Al Jolson, singing and talking in blackface in The Jazz Singer. With the exception of Oscar Michaud, the coming of sound meant the end of the road for most race filmmakers, who lacked the new and expensive recording technology, as well as the vocally trained talent. When The Scar of Shame was finally released, exhibitors were already saddled with a backlog of silent films few audiences were interested in seeing. By 1929, even many of the Black theaters in cities such as Philadelphia, Chicago, and New York were wired for sound, and sound was what audiences wanted. As filmmaker Thomas Cripps writes, the shock had changed Starkman from a little engine of ambition into a debt-ridden hanger-on who died of cancer in 1947. His marriage broken and his home foreclosed. Dudley fared better, but his string of theaters was hard hit during the Depression, and by 1930, he had sold off much of his chain. Before his death in 1940, S.H. Dudley was once again working with horses, breeding them on his farm in Oxon Hill, Maryland, and working with the Colored Actors Union, which he'd helped found in the early 1920s. He also began producing variety shows with his son, Sherman H. Dudley, Jr. The Scar of Shame is the only film known to have been directed by Frank Perugini, a white Italian-American cameraman from that pool of Philadelphia talent Charles Musser writes about. Perugini had previously worked on a number of independent productions, but the film's cinematographer, Alfonso Liguori, another Italian immigrant, was a bit more established, having previously shot 3 features for Adolf Zukor's Famous Players, soon to become Paramount Pictures. As I mentioned earlier, the story was written by Starkman himself, though according to interviews with surviving cast members, the actors were asked to improvise, and it's quite possible that S.H. Dudley, given his own illustrious past in the theater, was also responsible for creative input. That said, like 10 Nights in a Barroom, the plot of the film could have come straight out of a book by a white novelist, say a Theodore Dreiser, in which a young woman attempts to escape her squalid surroundings through an association with a respectable upper-class man, only to find herself fatally constrained by a rigid social hierarchy designed and determined to keep her in her place. In the tradition of didactic social problem films of the period, The Scar of Shame opens with a direct address to the audience in the form of a written foreword that scrolls up the screen and tells us what the film we are about to see is all about. It reads, environment, surroundings, childhood training, and companions. That is what shapes our destinies. And without the benefits of a knowing, loving hand to keep the lamp of knowledge burning, then will come sorrow and shame. To the trained ear, it's the language of the ideology of racial uplift, exhorting Black community leaders and the educated elite to not only hold themselves to standards of respectability and high moral rectitude, but to assume responsibility for elevating those unfortunates below them. And in the eyes of the urban elites of the northern cities in which The Scar of Shame would have played, there would have been many to uplift. By 1929, some 1.6 million Black Americans had escaped what amounted to neo-slavery in the New South and migrated northwards, many settling in cities like Philadelphia, where The Scar of Shame is set. Many of the more established northern Blacks looked down upon these new arrivals, which they saw as poor, uneducated, backwards, and pitifully demoralized, and very much in need of the knowing, loving hand that would keep the lamps of knowledge burning. But regardless of what the prologue tells us, what is The Scar of Shame really about? Ostensibly, it's the story of an ambitious young composer named Alvin Hilliard, who lives in a select Philadelphia area boarding house run by the respectable Lucretia Green. Next door, the poor and uneducated, though strikingly beautiful, Louise Howard dreams of escaping the drudgery of her lowly life and the brutality of her alcoholic stepfather, Spike. One afternoon, after witnessing Spike attempting to molest Louise, Alvin races to her rescue. Miss Green offers Louise refuge in the boarding house, and to keep her safe, Alvin impulsively proposes marriage, even though he knows his respectable mother would never approve of such a match. Louise, impressed by Alvin's sophistication, readily agrees. They marry, but as Alvin sets about reforming his bride by introducing her to the finer things, Eddie Blake, one of Miss Green's less respectable tenants, plots with Spike to lure Louise away from Alvin and put her to work in a nightclub. In his dress, intellect, and speech, Alvin Hilliard is coded as a respectable man, a member of the Black elite. Even Alvin's profession of composer, not songwriter, connotes uplift and cultural sophistication. Compare our hero to the villainous Eddie, who was introduced as, quote, a product of evil environment, whose music is not of the same school. As the musicologist Lawrence Schenbeck has written in Racial Uplift and American Music, 1878 to 1943, quote, cultivation of European classical music marked out the practitioner, whether a performer or listener, as a member of an elite group, and by example, it instructed the less fortunate in proper values and conduct, end quote. Louise, meanwhile, is introduced as a rose of Sharon, a biblical symbol of beauty and of Christ's love and sacrifice, and also the subject of a popular hymn of the 1920s. It might be said that Alvin is one of W.E.B. Du Bois's talented tenth, whom Du Bois defined as the best of the race, who will, quote, guide the mass away from the contamination and death of the worst in their own and other races. To urban audiences of 1929, Alvin would also have been seen as the latest iteration of the so-called New Negro, a modern type of Black American who originally emerged in the mid-1890s as a counterpoint to the derogatory old Negro stereotypes of plantation literature and the white supremacist discourse. Unlike the old Negro, the new Negro was sophisticated, respectable, and above all else, educated, and with a sense of noblesse oblige to uplift the less fortunate members of the race. And this is precisely what Alvin does. Like George Bernard Shaw's Henry Higgins, Alvin regards Louise as a project. She's described as an apt pupil. She's an experiment that puts the ideology of uplift to the test. Given an environment free from economic hardship and vice and exposed to the refinements of Western culture, even the lowliest can be raised a bit higher up the ladder, high enough, at least, to be saved from what Du Bois saw as the worst. Alvin and Louise marry in a small ceremony at the boarding house, but 3 months after the wedding, Louise appears despondent. Though she is now Alvin's wife, Louise has yet to meet her mother-in-law, and she begins to suspect that Alvin is ashamed of her low rank in society. The doll puppet Louise cradles in her otherwise empty lap points to another familial absence, a child. The breaking point comes when Louise discovers an old letter from Alvin's mother, in which Mrs. Hilliard, playing matchmaker, describes a romantic prospect as being, quote, a lady, and really of our set. Louise's suspicions are confirmed. No matter how improved her environment, no woman of her base group, to use Louise's word for it, would ever be permitted to join Alvin on the high rung of the Black social ladder. More than anything else in the film, more than environment, more than the machinations of Spike and Eddie, it is this intransigent hierarchy that will doom her marriage and eventually Louise herself. Several times throughout the film, when speaking of social position, the intertitles use the word caste rather than the more familiar term class. Thomas Cripps dismisses this as a rhetorical mistake. Surely the filmmakers meant class. Film scholar Jane Gaines similarly wonders why they chose to, quote, use a term that denotes a social ranking scheme that is even more rigid than a class-based system, and she takes it for a metaphor. I think David Starkman and his collaborators used the term caste on purpose, and they meant it literally. Furthermore, despite the prologue's talk about the benefits of surroundings, education, and exposure to the finer things in life, the usual tropes of uplift ideology, the undermining power of caste is what I think The Scar of Shame is really about. In the melodramas of the 19th and 20th centuries, the term half-caste was used to describe a character of mixed race, the possessor of a secret that, if known, needed to be carefully hidden, or, as in a number of race films, was learned just in time to save what was thought to be an unacceptable interracial relationship. Though derived from the same root, the word caste is used to denote one's rank in a society, a hereditary, unchangeable position that may be intertwined with race and class, but is not synonymous with them. For one thing, caste is immutable. We can change our economic status, and race, as we now understand, is a fluid construction subject to redefinition. For example, at one time in the United States, the white race did not include Irish, Italian, or German immigrants. In her 2020 book, Caste, The Origins of Our Discontents, Isabel Wilkerson writes that, quote, race is what we can see, the physical traits that have been given arbitrary meaning and become shorthand for who a person is. Caste is the powerful infrastructure that holds each group in its place. Caste is fixed and rigid. Race is fluid and superficial. Wilkerson makes a useful distinction between racism and casteism. Racism, she writes, is, quote, any action or institution that mocks, harms, assumes, or attaches inferiority or stereotype on the basis of the social construct of race. On the other hand, any action or structure that seeks to limit, hold back, or put someone in a defined ranking seeks to keep someone in their place by elevating or denigrating that person on the basis of their perceived category can be seen as casteism. For those in the marginalized classes, Wilkerson continues, casteism can mean seeking to keep those on your disfavored rung from gaining on you, to curry the favor and remain in the good graces of the dominant caste, all which serve to keep the structure intact. And as for class, Wilkerson further writes, it is an altogether separate measure of one's standing in society, marked by level of education, income, and occupation, as well as the attendant characteristics, such as an accent, taste, and manners that flow from socioeconomic status. These can be acquired through hard work and ingenuity, or lost through poor decisions or calamity. If you can act your way out of it, she concludes, then it is class, not caste. In other words, caste is fixed and unchangeable, and this immutable structure is not determined by one's environment, though one's caste can, and often does, determine the environment in which one lives. Caste is inherited, and its structure is buttressed by a number of factors, including legal and cultural prohibitions against marriage and the so-called mixing of blood. Thus, in The Scar of Shame, though there are no legal barriers to marrying within one's own race, Alvin knows he must keep his impetuous marriage to Louise secret from his mother, for whom, as the intertitles tell us, caste is one thing she is very determined about. And a doll will be the closest thing to a child Louise and Alvin will ever share. Poor little thing, Louise tells her substitute baby, after Alvin finally admits to his mother's caste prejudice and thoughtlessly crushes the doll's head underfoot. You too had to be a victim of caste. This explicit treatment of caste, which not only situates the characters in relation to one another, but drives the plot forward to its troubling and highly ambivalent conclusion, brings us at last to the film's most conspicuous absence: white society, the real dominant caste. Like Mrs. Hilliard, it remains invisible. At times, the white caste's phantom presence makes itself felt, as when Lucretia Green tells Louise that Alvin will someday be, quote, the leading composer of our race. This crucial absence suggests that a caste system that keeps Black Americans firmly in its place has not only been internalized, but replicated in miniature within Black society itself, with the new Negro elite assuming the role of the dominant caste. And while free of the utter dehumanization, terror, and violence on which the white supremacist caste system depends, the inflexibility of this microcaste system appears to tragically undercut the very project of racial uplift itself. I find The Scar of Shame to be a fascinatingly ambivalent film. Despite the didactic tone of the preface, it doesn't really offer any answers, and its ambivalence may be, in the end, unresolvable. This irresolution is further complicated by the interracial makeup of the Colored Players Film Corporation and the absence of any on-screen white characters. The production company's predominantly white composition makes the film's exposure of a fault line running through what Thomas Cripps calls the myth of Black success harder to bear than if the critique had come from a less ambiguously Black point of view. In the end, despite its cast and intended audience, I wonder if we can consider The Scar of Shame to be Black filmmaking at all. Or should we, following Audrey Thomas McCluskey, consider it at best a work of interracial collaboration? Well, the fact is, as Cripps has argued, race filmmaking in the United States was always already a complex interracial negotiation, particularly when it came to financing, not to mention the genres and forms within which Black filmmakers operated. The vectors of power and determination can be very difficult to discern and separate. But like the unseen white society in The Scar of Shame, which constructs an intractable caste system from its silent off-screen space, the forces of the white film industry must always be accounted for as a determinant, even in the most independent Black productions. In this context, self-determination, whether in the making of a film or within the larger struggle to define and project a racial identity in a racist society, will always be the site of conflict. And at best, like the final frames of The Scar of Shame, a scene of uneasy resolution.